let's start. You introduced Professor Rhys Andrews here and Professor Mário Aquino. One more time, thank you very much, Professor Rhys Andrews, to accept our invitation to your speech as keynote speaker to our division here, Public Administration or Management Division at ANPAD Association. Thanks a lot, Mário Aquino, Alves, to accept to discuss and to be with us here. And thanks all the ANPAD Association support. I say thanks to Professor Alqueta, representing all the people that works to do a very good conference. And Professor Rhys, our conference is big, very big conference with a lot of people from different parts of Brazil and abroad too. Professor Rhys Andrews is a professor of public management at Cardiff Business School, Cardiff University. Has interest of research on public management, corporate, political activity, cross-sector partnerships, business government relations, strategic management, corporatization, and public service performance. Have published widely in different journals, European Journal of Political Research, European Management Review, Human Relations, Journal of Public Administration Research and Theory, and a lot of more journals. And Professor Rhys Andrews has the Bachelor degree on Government by Essex, Master of Arts in Political Theory of University of Wales, and PhD on Politics in University of Wales. Is an editorial board member of Journal of Public Administration Research and Theory, Public Administration, Policy and Politics, Public Performance and Management Review, Local Government Studies, and Journal of Public Policy Studies. And has a lot of awards as best paper in different journals as International Review of Administrative Science, Journal of Public Administration Research, Public Management Review, Public and Non-Profit Division of Academy of Management. And today, Professor Rhys will discuss with us Publicness and hybridity in public administration. Professor Rhys, thanks a lot to be here with us. Welcome, and the floor is yours. Thanks a lot.
Well, thank you for that very, very nice and kind introduction. I hope my presentation matches up to some of the introduction. Okay, so I'll start my slideshow shortly. So what I'm going to do is talk about publicness and hybridity, but I'm going to focus in particular on a research agenda I've been working on in the past 3 or 4 years, which is the corporatization of local public services. So I'll start with a little bit of kind of theoretical discussion and then present some empirical data with a view to kind of sort of demonstrating the importance, if you like, of some of the theoretical concerns in the actual real world. And then Mario has kindly offered to comment on the presentation, and then we'll hopefully have an interesting debate after that. So I'll open up my screen now, and I'm hoping that'll work, and then take it from there. Okay. Start at the beginning would be a good idea. Okay, so thanks again for inviting me to speak to EnANPAD today. It's a great honour to be able to share some of my thoughts and some of my research with everyone. I've been working in Cardiff University now for, I think it is 21 years. Started under Professor George Boyne, who's an expert in public service performance, especially in local government. And my work has really grown out of my association with George. He's now far too important to get his hands dirty in research. He's the president of Aberdeen University, but some of us in Cardiff are still sort of carrying the flame of his research agenda forward. And this is some of the fruits of the research I've been doing recently around corporatization and publicness at the local level. And you may notice some small advertisements for various organizations on this opening slide, and these are some municipal corporations, very prominent corporations that we see across Europe. So one of the things I'm going to talk about is how prevalent that's corporatization, public services has become in Europe in the last 10, 20 years or so. Before we get on to corporatization, I wanted to sort of touch on some sort of theoretical concerns. So in doing that, I wanted to focus first on the issue of hybridity. And this is something that a lot of top PA scholars have been writing a lot about recently. And the reason they do that is because we've seen, since new public management and the entrance of more sort of business style practices, more contracting out, privatization, and then through new public governance, a move to more sort of partnership style approach to the service delivery of public organizations, that hybridity, differences, the blending of different ways of doing things across sectors, across organizations has become a really big thing. I'm not going to spend too much time trying to pin down what hybridity is. I'm mostly an empirical researcher, so what I like to do is test theories rather than necessarily try and do that really important work of theory development. But what I did want to do was to talk about how I think publicness theory, if we think back to where that comes from, Barry Bozeman's work in the 1980s around organizational publicness especially, I'm going to try and make the case that that is a very useful way of trying to understand hybridity amongst public service organizations, and importantly also a really nice way to try and do some empirical studies to understand the way in which hybridity affects the behavior, the structure, the processes and outcomes that we see in organizations that provide public services. So what I'm going to do first is to think a little bit about what we mean by hybridity, but not too much, before I say something then about publicness and the intersection of publicness and hybridity through corporatization processes. So this is corporatization, for those of you who mightn't be too familiar with the debates around that, is basically where a previously state-provided local public service or national public service is transferred to a corporate form. Now, it could be a state-owned enterprise, or it could be various other forms of more or less public organization. Clearly a good example of a sort of hybrid situation. So I won't say too much more about that now, but I'll go back to it in a little while. I'm not sure if my slides are a little bit wonky in terms of how they're being presented at the moment, but the first I wanted to just say is that hybridity in public administration is a multi-level phenomenon. So this isn't something that just applies to organizations, it's something that's observed at the macro level when we think about the governance of countries across the world now, or even international institutions. We have very, very sort of much more complex institutional arrangements that mold together different institutional logics, different values and different approaches to doing things in ways that perhaps weren't so much the case, certainly, let's say, 30 or 40 years ago. So there's some of the things that there's lots of debates around, you know, the extent to which we see polyarchy, which is the way in which a pluralist democracy involves different stakeholders. Again, urban regime theory talks about hybridity in terms of the different sort of partnerships between public, private and non-profit organizations and how they produce public policy at various levels again. So that's the macro level. The meso level, I mean, I've highlighted organizations here, but it could also incorporate professions and or other sorts of institutional fields that exist within every country, as we know. So this is where my main area of focus is. I mostly study organizational performance in the public sector. And so good examples of hybrids here are municipal corporations, public-private partnerships, clearly also an example of an organization or a hybrid arrangement that brings together different ways of doing things. And we also see hybridity at the micro level as well, not just in terms of the big, broader umbrellas through which public services are delivered, but in terms of the actual management and provision of services. We see that public managers are expected to have multiple roles. So we see things like boundary spanning being encouraged, where certain individuals are expected to kind of work together with different organizations. So there are new roles in terms of the way in which public managers do things. And even in terms of, if we think about new public management and the business emphasis that we got through new public management, things like strategic management professionals, marketing, and all these kind of corporate style professions that weren't seen before in the public sector, but certainly in countries like the UK and the European countries. So hybridity is a multi-level phenomenon, but my focus in my research is generally on the organizational level, and today I'm going to talk a bit more about local public services in particular. So when we try to think in a little bit more detail about what we mean by hybridity in public organizations, there are a lot of interesting articles out there trying to pin down exactly what that means. The quote I've put on the slide here first from Tom Christensen and Pellegrini, I think encapsulates kind of the essence of what that really means in terms of hybridity in public administration. So instead of there being either state-led provision where the government does everything or everything is contracted out to private providers, we have much more cases where we have arrangements that combine all kinds of, as they put it, different tasks, values and organizational forms. And I've already alluded to some of the kind of varieties in which those things can be debated, discussed and articulated. So there's a whole literature course on institutional logics, on different public and private values and so on. But the important thing to note in terms of the kind of challenges it poses for public managers is that it generates these hybrid arrangements, generate trade-offs that have to be made and tensions. And in particular, those tensions are especially present between, if you like, the value of efficiency versus the value of democracy. And this is something that more recently, Vakuri and Johnson have tried to analyze in terms of how public organizations and public managers respond to and cope with, if you like. And they talk about those tensions between different logics or different values being managed through different types of value creation mechanisms. I just wanted to say a little bit about this because I think it's quite a nice way of trying to understand some of the kind of outcomes that we observe in terms of hybridity and public services. So this is a quick diagram which sort of encapsulates the main ideas, I think, of Vakuri and Johansson. And this is the idea that there are lots of different ways of thinking about the sources of hybridity, from ownership to institutional logics, different multiplicity of goals, funding arrangements, and then different versions of control and regulation, all of which produce considerable variety in terms of what public organizations look like now and the kinds of things that they're expected to achieve. And according to them, they suggest that this gives rise to 3 different ways of coping with that situation. So this is where we see organizations or managers even having to successfully find some way to either mix values, or they're inevitably, because of the tensions between these different sources of hybridity, they have to compromise on particular values. So for example, if an organization is required to produce waste management or collect waste to a particular level to a target of particular efficiency, let's say rate, then it may be they have to compromise on some values relating to the quality of the service, for instance. Likewise, the other mechanism that Vakuri and Johansson talk about is the idea that in some cases, hybrid organizations prefer to just legitimize the key values or the core values they focus on. Let's say, for example, in a sort of contradiction to the previous example, a situation where an organization says, well, efficiency is not something we see as our core business. For example, in, let's say, the provision of adult social care for vulnerable people, efficiency is something that is our secondary consideration after we've provided good quality care for those vulnerable people. So in that situation, if we've got a hybrid set of arrangements to provide services, it might be that professionals choose to put their core values, the values that they think are what give them legitimacy, above other types of values, for example, business values. So what I wanted to do next was to speak a little bit more about some of the kind of sources of hybridity, and the way in which I wanted to do that was by thinking about publicness. So here we're focusing on issues of ownership and, let's say, public control over hybrid style organizations, and the way in which you can explain the level of hybridity on the basis of those different sources of potential hybridity. There's a lot of reasons why I think publicness is particularly useful for doing that. Obviously, traditionally, publicness research did focus on issues of public versus private. Bozeman sort of steered us all in the right direction by saying, well, it's not just either or, there's a continuum. But one of the most sort of interesting insights that he had about publicness was that to identify how privately owned or organizations where the private sector has, or the market has a bigger role to play, those organizations have to respond to what he describes as the economic authority of the market. So that means the value of efficiency, being able to provide services, being able to be competitive in a marketplace. And then he contrasts that with where publicness, public ownership is more important, being driven by the political authority of the state. And so the value of legitimacy, or let's say democracy, becomes much more important. As I mentioned, his key insight is that varies considerably. So what I wanted to do next was just give you a quick indication of where I think, this is just my own particular interpretation of how we can understand the different modes of providing local public services, at least in the UK and perhaps other countries as well, in terms of this focus on publicness and the difference between the values of economic and political authority. So I don't know if you could read the title at the top there, but this is the way in which publicness plays out in terms of organizational hybridity in local public services. So this is adapted from some of Bozeman's work, in which he looked at more so sort of specific organizations within the US sort of public sector and related areas. But I think for the local public services, you can say that where the economic authority of the market is at its highest is when you get rid of your state-run services altogether and parcel them off to the private sector. And then from there, obviously at the further end of the scale, where political authority is really important, you have state control over the services altogether. The interesting thing in terms of hybridity for myself is that state-owned enterprises can encompass nearly all of these types of models. And that's really a kind of important point, because there's no such thing as a single model of a state-owned enterprise, and there are all kinds of different sources of hybridity. And this is why also we have all these very different tensions, difficulties in resolving the mixing of values, or the extent to which you can be, the extent to which you might need to compromise or legitimize certain values in municipal corporations, which are effectively a kind of state-owned enterprise. So what I wanted to do now is to say a little bit more about municipal corporations as hybrid organizations, and then kind of finish the presentation by exploring how that kind of looks in the case of England. So we mentioned municipal corporations are a type of state-owned enterprise, and they're a hybrid organization because they can have the role of the economic authority or the political authority varies considerably. So in the case of the UK and also most other European countries, I think you'd say they can be either completely owned by a municipality, which means they're a little bit closer to the political authority end of the spectrum, or they can be almost completely owned by the private sector, in which case, obviously, they're much more focused on sort of economic authority. And in that sense, they can come in kind of any shape and size to some extent, although certain types tend to predominate, and I'll show you some information about that shortly. There's a nice quote from Collins et al. Paper in 2009, which explains why that is such a difficult kind of managerial problem for these types of organizations. It's that they are both private in the sense that they have to act in the same way that private companies do, and they're subject to the same types of laws around auditing and accounting that private companies have. But at the same time, ultimately, they're supposed to be responsible, at least via their parent organizations, to the citizens. Now, I already mentioned, although in principle there can be a lot of variation in terms of the ways in which these organizations can be sort of constituted, in general, we tend to see, and this diagram gives you an overview of the main types, and it makes it seem like there's quite a lot, but some of the research previously has listed, Grossi and Reichert listed about 14 or 15 different main forms of municipal corporations. I won't say too much about each of them, but what I will say is that these three in the middle are the ones that we tend to see most in Europe. So a municipal corporation, especially in the Netherlands, but also Scandinavian countries, are often operate under public law and are intermunicipal companies. So the level of public ownership there is generally very high. What we see then is moving from that kind of situation more to the kind of profit-making companies that we see, especially in the United Kingdom. So this is where they take the form of a limited company that's set up by a municipality, and that may be either completely owned by the municipality, or it may be mostly owned even by a private company. So for example, infrastructure projects in the UK often take the form of a company form. And it might be that a building contractor is in charge of the organization. Now, in between those two kind of, not exactly extremes, but in those two kind of major difference approaches are mixed enterprises, which are more like public-private partnerships. But for whatever set of reasons, those are not always as popular outside of continental Europe. I think in the UK, local governments tend to prefer to have a company set up, and they do that with a private firm as happily as they do set up a public-private partnership. Other things that we see here as well, and I won't say too much about those right now, are a variety of different not-for-profit types of municipal corporation. And they're very interesting there, right? And they tend to be less sort of controlled by the municipalities. So for example, I've just been doing a bit of research on leisure trusts in England. They're basically almost completely autonomous. They don't have any level of public ownership, but usually the municipality will have some representatives sitting on the board of those organizations. And that tends to be, you'll notice as well, that municipal corporations, the different types tend to prevail in different kind of service areas. So we see that mixed enterprises and profit-making companies tend to be based around infrastructure services and utilities, transportation and so on. Whereas the non-profit types of corporation tend to be in more social services and housing. So there's a lot of variation in terms of legal forms, in terms of public ownership, in terms of the autonomy that they are able to gain from political oversight, and a lot of variation across countries and service areas. So massive potential for hybridity to be particularly prevalent in these organizations, but with nonetheless different challenges depending on those different forms and different levels of public ownership, political control. So what I wanted to do now, though, was just explore and kind of illustrate this in a little bit more depth using some data that I've collected. So I mentioned earlier, I'm primarily an empirical researcher. I like to share data that I've collected, especially as it's usually taken me a long time to collect it. So what I wanted to do was just to sort of illustrate how publicness plays out in corporatization in the English case. So I mentioned right at the start of the presentation that there's been a massive growth in the use of these corporations to provide local public services. And we've seen that in England in particular, more so than in other parts of the UK. And what you can see here between 2009 and 17, there was a massive growth, particularly in the use of companies limited by shares, which is basically an LLC, if you like, in the United States terminology. So a private company which is profit making, and they have more than doubled in the past 10 years, and this is in the most important local authorities across England. When you drill down into the next level below these most important ones, a similar pattern emerges as well. So around about 2009, just around the time of the global financial crisis, there would have been about 200 or so of the private company style municipal corporations, and now there's around about 1,000 or something like that. And the reasons why this has taken off is to some extent related to economic pressures within English local government, and also the kind of situation where UK central government, having had a lot of control over and spent a lot of money supporting local public services, has withdrawn that support and has kind of left local governments on their own to figure out how to finance their own activities. And we will look at the types of service, similar to the kind of table I showed you earlier. We see that, as you might expect, if there's been a big growth in profit-making companies, that tends to be around the area of economic development, and mostly that has been around the development of housing estates and other infrastructure type projects, which often involve the private sector, but not always. So what I wanted to do next is just show you an indication of levels of publicness on average within these corporations. So in terms of public ownership, whereas let's say in the Netherlands, which is a sort of hotbed of intermunicipal corporations, public ownership is up towards 100%. In in England, public ownership hovers around 70%. So that suggests on average, these corporations have quite a lot of private sector involvement. In terms of political oversight, which in Bozeman's kind of parlance is political control dimension of publicness, they're around about, on average, 12% of the boards, 12% of the directors on the boards of municipal corporations are politicians. So that's around about 1 or 2 politicians on those boards that do have politicians on them. Many boards don't have any politicians at all overseeing the provision of the services, particularly profit-making companies. And theoretically speaking, there might be good reasons for that, because politicians might seek to kind of try to gain much more control over the kind of goals of these organizations. And if they're profit making, you want the business focus, the value of efficiency, and the impact of economic authority perhaps to be greater. So at the bottom, I've just presented some very basic correlations which tell you something about the kind of relationships between public ownership and service areas and types of organization. So for ownership, you can see that CLS, that means a company limited by share. CLG is a company limited by guarantee, which is a non-profit. There's no relationship there between publicness, public ownership, and the type of corporation that's introduced. However, you could see from the correlations that publicly owned corporations are more prevalent in back office services, culture, housing, social care, usually areas that are much more politically sensitive, especially social care and housing, and less prevalent in areas like property development. Again, we're looking at bringing private contractors in to do a job of building a new housing estate or what have you. And we have some similar patterns in terms of politicians on the company boards as well. But this time we see that for profit-making companies, politicians are less prevalent on the board, whereas for non-profits, they're more prevalent. And this reflects the kind of focus, if you like, in terms of their values. So politicians will be more concerned to be involved in the decision-making of non-profits, which have what we describe in the UK, at least, as a public benefit requirement. They have to demonstrate that they're doing good things for the community. Whereas in the case of a profit-making form, the idea there is to make sure it's a viable business and that it's not going to be too influenced by broader political considerations. And I can tell you more about the extent to which that's successfully resolved or not later on, if that would be of interest. In terms of, those are the kind of some of the structures and processes that we see in terms of publicness, and I've done some analysis of the extent to which publicness might affect the performance. Now, at the moment, there aren't publicly available performance indicators looking at social outcomes or environmental outcomes or all these other things that we really care about in terms of what public service organizations are supposed to do. So I'm reliant solely on financial performance indicators. And in that sense, I'm looking at classic business management indicators of performance, like the return on assets of these organizations and return on capital. Now, here it suggests that publicness doesn't make any difference to that. So in that sense, you can say that the hybridity, the relative degree of hybridity or not within these municipal corporations doesn't seem to make a difference to their financial performance. There are some other things that do, but you know, I wouldn't want to spend too much time worrying about that. But just to kind of sort of emphasize that in essence here, we don't see a payoff, if you like, from greater public control over these corporations, but neither do we see a penalty. So it could be that in mixing these values, there's some kind of the benefits and the costs kind of cancel each other out, at least on average. It may vary by service. One thing that I did find when analysing these kinds of issues further is that publicly owned, majority owned municipal corporations were much less likely to be dissolved than those that had majority private ownership. So this tells you that municipal corporations that are owned largely by local governments, those local governments have much more commitment to keeping those organizations going, and they're investing more time and political capital in ensuring that those organizations continue to fulfill the public purpose for which they were set up. So this is an important kind of finding insofar as it tells you that although publicness doesn't seem to make a difference to financial performance, it matters to the kind of sustainability of these business models. And in fact, it may be that commitment to kind of legitimacy and the maintenance of services through this model, at least at the moment, is more important than the kind of commitment to kind of business style values. So I conclude that was a bit of a whistle-stop tour through some theory at the start, and then a kind of the empirical setting of municipal corporatization in England. And this is something that's very prevalent in a lot of other countries. We've got a comparative book looking at corporatization across 19 countries that will be published, I think, before the end of this year. And in nearly all of those countries, we see that municipal corporations are increasingly being used to provide services, increasingly being used to provide social services, and increasingly taking a profit-making form. So this form of hybridity is becoming much, much more prevalent, particularly at least in European countries, but I'm sure that that's something that we'll observe in other countries as well. What I think the research that I've been doing in England kind of shows a little bit is that publicness is one way in which you can start to analyze and understand the dynamics of some of this development, as well as some of the outcomes from it. That said, there are a lot of other things that certainly that I need to investigate further, and that it would be really interesting for other people to kind of jump in and have a look at as well, especially the extent to which the publicness variables that you're able to deploy in analysing municipal corporations, the extent to which those variables might influence the social and environmental performance of corporations. Likewise, investigations, qualitative, quantitative, of any kind, of the extent to which and the ways in which politicians and public managers interact with the directors of municipal corporations and, if you like, influence their management strategies and practices, is something that I think would be really interesting for people to look at. One of the interesting debates around that type of issue relate to the extent to which municipal corporations might use hybrid management strategies. So, and this plays into Vakuri and Johansson's idea of different value mechanisms. So do managers adopt different ways of mixing, compromising, legitimating different values in the process of trying to manage and cope with all these different tensions? And would publicness be an interesting way to kind of try and capture the different mechanisms that they tend to rely on in certain situations? And I think, I mean, there are many more things we can always think of that merit further research, but those are just some of the things that I think at the moment, within the context of this presentation, would be very interesting to look at in more detail. So at that point, I'd just like to say, thank you for listening, and if you've got any questions, then please do raise them, and I look forward to Mario's reactions to what I've said as well. Thank you. I'll close my screen if that would make sense.
Thanks a lot, Professor Rhys. Andrews, very interesting research and questions to discuss and compare here in Brazil. Please, Mário, your speech or considerations, comments, and after that, we open to the audience to questions. Mário, please. And thanks, Professor Rhys. Thanks a lot. Mário, your microphone is plugged. Yeah.
Almost 3 years using Zoom, and I still don't I still don't manage to turn on the microphone, but that's it. So, Professor Andrews, thank you very much for your presentation. It was very insightful, and as I said, well, I was just wondering why Theo asked me to come here to make this kind of comments once I am from the nonprofit sector. Well, at least I work with nonprofit sector and civil society, but and then my experience on hybridity comes from this set of organizations on this. But I think from your presentation we can have an interesting dialogue here. And what I will try to do here is to create a form of dialogue with our situation here in Brazil, with the situation, not only with the situation of hybridization and corporatization and public services, which is something that is there, but also running some sort of different forms of translation, not only linguistic translation, but also a conceptual translation on this. So I think this is something that that might, and to try to help the scholarship here, because as you have mentioned, and recently in a paper on corporatization, we have here in Brazil a very interesting history on state-owned enterprises, and we have a good path of scholarship who has been recently written by colleagues like Sandro Cabral and Sergio Lazzarini, who have been working especially with the big state-owned enterprises and the big state at the federal level in terms of how the issue of publicness is around there. And I would say with a little bit of a very negative flavor on this, but okay, it's their research and their perspective on this, or especially Professor Lazzarini, but it's okay. So this is something that is, so state-owned enterprises here are something that are very common. They have been very common in terms of the big infrastructure in the big infrastructure systems here, so from the federal government. But, and here it enters some issues here. As we are a federal state, so we have some sort of different jurisdictional differences here in terms of service provision, which became much more clear with the after 1988 with the new constitution, which has set some and has provided some much more clear jurisdictional roles in different public policies, but and for also different public service. But even in the past, even before 1988, we were also, especially at the municipal level, we were used to run some sort of mixed enterprises companies to run especially those kind of services, those very infrastructural services like sanitation and water distribution, which is something that is there. Sometimes with municipalities running their own companies, or at the state level running different municipalities within the state. So we have this. This is the issue in Rio de Janeiro. This is in the state of Rio de Janeiro, the state of São Paulo. But we have also municipal companies running this. The same with waste management. Mostly we had state-owned companies at the municipal level trying to running these kind of services. And of course, the issue of energy, which is also very complicated here in Brazil, because we used to have a federal grid that was connected to a big thing that is called Eletrobras, but we had also the local state-owned companies like the energy companies there, and also the differences between production and distribution. So these are some of these issues. But of course, especially during the 90s, what we have experienced here was part of a process of making them become public, which means that privatizing some of these facilities, trying to privatize some of these facilities. And in order to privatize, what was interesting in some of these cases, especially at the state and the municipal level, what we had was the creation of some forms of hybridity, which means that, well, we had some of these companies going to the market, opening their capital, selling shares to the public, but at the same time with the control, still the control by the public sector, by the state, and of course all the pressures that we had in terms of privatizing them or not. And it has led to a very interesting thing here, it has led to a huge debate, ideological debate on on the pros and cons on this process of privatization. But at the same time, it has contaminated the way we did research, which means that, well, actually, we did not carry it on well researched based on evidence-based research, for example, to tell us how can we evaluate this, how can we evaluate these models because of these very ideological debates. And at the end, only recently, we can say that we have in academia people that are trying to bring some fresh evidence-based research, trying to see, well, what are the pros or what are the cons, and etc. So the first thing is to try to understand how we have been approaching here this issue in academia. But then we need to think of what's going on, especially in terms of understanding local services and local public services provision. We have moved recently to different forms of hybridization, sometimes, and the majority of these forms of privatization, instead of going through a process of corporatization, or at least what we could understand as a corporatization, they went through a process of hybridization through the nonprofit sector or the not-for-profit sector for some reasons. And what is interesting, for example, is, in terms of waste management. It's interesting that we have the private sector entering here, doing some PPPs, but at the same time, legislation and also the pressure from social movements allowed, for example, the emergence of waste pickers cooperatives, for example, to run these services there. So it's very interesting because, for example, the major issue of garbage collection here belongs to the big corporations, private corporations running there. But at the same time, you have waste picker cooperatives running this, and this is something that is new. It's there, so it's something that has been run. It's not all. It's a process that is in the legislation, but not all the municipalities run with this. Some municipalities, because of different state capacities and what we would call civil society capacities or nonprofit sector capacities themselves, they run it in a different thing. So this is something that is being run, and it's now, I think, time in terms of a research agenda for us, for example, to try to understand what kind of public value we could see from this form of hybridization. So this is one thing. The other thing, which is very complicated here, is some forms of charter schools that are emerging here, especially at the state level, and some projects that are trying to bring it at the municipal level. Actually, in the municipal level, we were very well known to hybridity due to, for example, the system, the public system of nurseries and kindergartens in different parts of the country, and there was a lot of clash between the public attorney, the different public attorney's office, and the municipalities, for example, because they were clashing about the publicness of this. So we need to have a lot of slots for babies and children to be taken care at nurseries and kindergarten, but at the same time, most of the public attorney office are claiming that, well, this goes against publicness, and this is a service that must remain completely public. And so there are clashes, like in the state of São Paulo, in the state of Pernambuco, they had these kind of clashes, in spite of the fact that there is a long tradition of running these kind of services from private nonprofit organizations, especially religious organizations who are around this. So I think this is something that we need to think of. And I think just because, of course, it's only a major comment here, I think there is some room for us to improve some of our research on this. And I think, and this would be very beneficial. For example, studies on the input-output matrices between the sectors. So how value is generated? How can we use the national social accountancy systems in order to try to understand how value has been generated, not only in terms, of course, in terms of the economic value, but which is very important, even to try to understand how the issue of hybridization goes. But on the other hand, it is also very important to try to bring the attention of the debate, the tension between publicness and the shareholders' value. So this is something that is also run, especially when we see in some major challenges that we have, especially in great metropolitan areas like the great regions of São Paulo, Rio, Recife, where we have some sort of private, some sort of PPPs running, and where we would need to say, well, what are the limits? Because some of these processes came without paying too much attention to the role of regulation and the role of the place where the public is there to be in the regulation. I have Alqueta here. Alqueta is the person to talk about regulation here. So I'm not going to say any kind of mistakes here. Otherwise, she will complain against me. But that's something that is very important here. So to try to understand, and also I think, and this is something that we can talk together, and I think it's important, is the role of the devolved or the devolution systems. Because as you said, for example, most of the increase, and it was interesting for your chart, you brought it from 2009 to 2018, the increase of municipal corporations in England, which also is connected to some sort of the devolution of some services to some municipal authorities, even the creation of the mayor posts in different areas and etc. And because you were very centralized, and we have something that is in between, because although since 1988, we had, at least we thought we had very clear definitions of the jurisdiction between the federal government, the state government, and municipal government. We still have clashes on jurisdiction and the forms of jurisdiction, especially in terms of how you were going to finance this, because of the question of the distribution of the financing of these services. So I think that there is some room here also to make some some very interesting comparative work and to develop this. So I'm just going to rest my case here. Thank you very much for the opportunity to make this to make these comments, and I'll be very glad to help you to guide you to make questions to Professor Andrews, and that's it. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Mario, for connect the research of Professor Rhys Andrews with our contest here in Brazil. Very good points that you talk to us. Let's open to the audience. I have some questions, but I will be after the audience to do some questions. Someone would like to do some comment or put some question to debate? Please open your Leonardo Pila. Please open your video and microphone. Present yourself and put your question, please.
Okay, I'm Leonardo Pila. I'm a PhD student at the Fundação from Getúlio Vargas Foundation, and I am currently studying state-owned enterprises, and this is a very interesting presentation, Professor Rhys. Thank you very much. It was very interesting and engaging. And I have some questions. Firstly, you bring a very interesting research result that you showed that there is no difference between financial results in those corporations that are majority or minority owned by the public sector and the private owned companies. And it's very interesting. Recent research is indeed converging in that. But for example, Sergio Lazarini's research and Ruth Aguilera's research are showing similar results, but there may be some heterogeneity, for example, when you consider some contingencies such as economic crisis, or, for example, political contingencies that may increase the temptation of the governments to intervene in such kind of companies. So first question is related to your research. What was the time horizon that you considered, and this result holds, for example, for all the sectors, or for specific profit-seeking sectors, for example? And the other question is, for example, for Brazil, which is an emerging country where the institutional environment is not so mature as England or other European countries, the temptation of the government to intervene by including, for example, politicians in the boards of directors, and making these directors to influence in the strategies of the companies is more it's more likely to happen in such weak institutional environments in emerging countries. So if you can bring some comments about this. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Leonardo, for those questions. They're very insightful. Just to sort of clarify on that particular piece of analysis, so that was between 2009, 2017, and I controlled for the different sectors in which the services were being delivered. So, but it's still an average. So I haven't broken it down and analysed it in different sectors, which I think would probably turn up some differences. In terms of political contingencies, it's a little bit more tricky to sort of model those at the level of the local authority company, but I'm sure there may be ideological differences in terms of commitment to certain models and in terms of the likelihood to which politicians may or may not feel legitimized in, let's say, interfering in the management of the corporations. In terms of the ways in which that interference does or doesn't happen in a European context, I think at least in the case of England, there's no hard and fast regulation of any of this, but the sort of advisory bodies, professional advisory bodies, tend to suggest that politicians should be kept off those boards. And most politicians are keen to be kept off the boards because, particularly for companies limited by shares, they're personally liable for any failure of those organizations. So in that sense, there are incentives for politicians to stay away from them. That being said, there are cases, especially that have come to light in Sweden, which I'm sure we'd agree would have well-developed institutional structures, where there have been cases of corruption through the placement of politicians on these boards of directors. So they're rewarded by their party leader with a post on the board of directors, and they're able to collect a salary. Even in the case of England, there has been, I'm going to say even as though it's a place of shining light, but there are cases in England as well where there have been people the politicians who are using these corporations as ways to make money for themselves, or taking on consultancies or giving work to their friends through their directorships on the boards of these companies as well. So some of this stuff has come to light, some of it less so, but I think it's an area that I think across Europe, as these corporations become more influential, I think regulation of how they operate is going to become a bigger issue as well. So I hope that answers your question.
Okay, thanks. More questions? Okay, please.
Thank you very much, Rhys. I guess my question kind of reflects differences between the UK, England, particularly environment, and the Brazilian environment. The most striking difference to me is the local versus the central approach that we have toward the state-owned enterprises, or the public is broader in.
I think, okay, internet is not working well, the connection of Okita. Someone is listening, Okita talking?
No.
No,
I think she had problems with her connection.
Yeah, I sent a WhatsApp message to her.
Ok. Acho que Leonardo, você levantou a mão, eu acho que talvez você possa fazer uma pergunta enquanto a Alqueta está reconectando.
Yes. While she manages to come back, I'd like to make another question, another comment, indeed. So we are mainly talking about when we are talking about hybridity, we are mainly talking about the tensions between the public sector and the private sector. So Alqueta came back, so I make my question later.
My internet dropped. I think it's also tired by 3 years of Zoom meetings. Sorry, I don't know if you heard some of my question, or do I need to start again?
You were talking about the differences between the institutional differences between England and Brazil, for example.
Yeah, I mean more
more
centralized approach and a more local approach. And I was asking I'd like to hear about your view about how, I mean, this more local approach, if it's helpful, if it works to kind of answer the global challenges, you know, the most pressing tests are inequality, or, you know, sustainability, or the climate change, or, I mean, those pressing issues. Do you think that this model, this more decentralized local model, is a good model to give answers to that, or not?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting change that we've seen in England, especially, where under the Labour government in the 2000s, there were lots of targets and lots of, let's say, grants and funding was attached to hitting of some of those targets related to those global challenges. And I think we've done small bits of research that suggested that seemed to be effective. What's happened, I think, since then with the various types of Conservative government, they've describe themselves as localists, which is what all UK central governments always do. Whatever policy they're imposing on local government is localism. But it's my interpretation of it to some extent would be they sort of abandoned local government rather than it's a sort of a policy to support local strategies for dealing with these types of big issues. So in that sense, so for example, the money that they've been distributing has been significantly cut back, and this is part of the reason why local authorities have been setting up companies to try and find new ways to resource their organisations. And there's very little pressure from the centre around these types of grand challenges anymore. There are no hard and fast targets on anything, as far as I can tell, other than cases of social care failure, especially children's social care, where those kinds of things appear in the news very quickly, and so that's a pressure point for local authorities. But I think, okay, I think Mário mentioned this devolution to combined authorities in places like Manchester. That can be kind of interpreted in a couple of different ways. In a sense, it is devolution, but it's it's where before the money was distributed direct to local governments. A lot of that money has been held by central government, and these new institutions, metro mayors and so on, that were set up purely to kind of enable central government to give some money, but for the things that they cared about, which in the last 10 years or so has been mostly related to economic development. So the sort of jury's out really on whether that is an effective approach or not. It might be, done some research recently, which suggests it might be for economic performance, but again, social, environmental is very much more up in the air, and we'll see, I guess. I don't know if that answers your question.
Very good. I have some comments and some questions, but Leonardo has some comments first. Please, Leonardo, one more time.
Okay, thanks. Just a comment. One important challenge for hybrid organizations are the measurement, the definition and the measurement of social or non-financial or non-economic performance. And this relates exactly to the tensions between the public sector and the private sector, and how administration will cope with that tensions. So the financial performance is more straightforward, so you can manage to conduct research with large hands, but social and non-financial or non-economic performance is more complicated. to deal with that, and how can we make research with large N, considering the social and environmental and other performance dimensions of this kind of hybrid organizations.
Let me put some compliments on the Leonardo comments and questions, because one question of mine is about generation of value. Could you talk a little bit more about the avenue for future research about public value generation? For example, the research of Mariana Mazzucato about the value of everything in this book, for example, in the state entrepreneur, is a very good background to bring the social and the environmental values to this kind of analysis too. Please.
Yeah, I think I agree. It's been a key issue for measuring the performance of public organisations for a long time. How you can actually get at the kind of social, environmental, and non-financial performance of these organisations, which obviously in the case of public sector and also hybrids that provide public services, that's often much more important than the pure financials. The sort of challenge in terms of state-owned enterprises is it's quite easy to get lots of financial performance data, but at least in the case of the UK, at the local level and also at the national level, usually these organisations don't have to report on social or environmental outcomes. So what I found thus far, at least, is that I can get plenty of information that I can use perhaps even to establish efficiency levels in municipal corporations, because they have to publish an annual financial statement. But the government, as I mentioned earlier, the regulation is very, very underdeveloped. So there's very little effort made centrally to understand any of that. In fact, the UK central government barely knows how many of these organisations are out there. One thing I'm hoping to explore in the next year or so is looking in a specific sector. Now, with some corporations, I think it is possible, because there's still performance data collected at the municipal level. If it's a wholly owned organisation that does all of a particular service, I can find data, for example, let's say if there was a wholly owned waste management company providing all the waste management in a municipality, there is municipal level recycling statistics I could use to look at performance, also carbon dioxide emission data. So there are ways to do it, but then you're limiting yourself to looking at, let's say in this case, only those organisations which are wholly owned by the local authority, or only those organisations which provide all of the services in a particular area for a municipality. And that's not the typical case. In many cases, say for example, social care companies, several local authority owned companies, some of which have private involvement, might provide different types of services for different types of needs in the community. So it is a super complex environment to try and look at those types of outcomes, unfortunately, at the moment. Whether it'll become more regulated, we were very lucky in the UK still to have quite a highly developed performance indicators in most areas of the public sector. But as I say, at the moment, in this area of state-owned enterprises, very little clear data is available for that. I mean, one thing that people often might do then, and there are pros and cons for it, is to run surveys asking organisations to rate their own performance. And that might be if you were a PhD student, you were particularly interested in doing that, that I think would be a good way forward for definitely getting, multiple cases you can ask about them to rate their performance in terms of whatever it might be, social outcomes, environmental outcomes, and so on. The challenge then you have is that you've got subjective performance data, and that poses its own kind of problems. So I think that would be one way forward, at least.
Okay, thanks. Alqueta,
And
after
I have another
Alqueta,
question.
I do some
Yes.
questions. So, Alqueta, please.
Do you have other questions? No, okay, you have other participants.
I have other question, but you first, please.
Okay, thanks. Rhys, your example about the personal liability of politicians and their reluctance to enter in the board was very interesting to me, because one of I mean, for Brazil and for most of the developing countries, the weak institutional environment is the key obstacle, you know, for PPP, publicists, etc., at least in literature and extensive research. So I always wonder, what does it actually mean, the weak institutional environment? So we have, for example, good laws, it's a good legal framework, a strong legal framework. A basic feature that probably lacks in Brazil is personal liability. So people that take decisions that they are not personally judicialized or whatever for their wrongdoing if they do it wrong. Even Leonardo's research, for example, is trying to see the difference if you are in the U.S. stock markets, is basically traduced in terms of being responsible, personally liable for your decisions in the board of public-owned company. So I want to hear your thoughts about that. Do you think, I mean, is this whole discussion about the weak institutional environment probably reduced to a more concrete indicator of, you know, having basic indicators of personal responsibility, liability, being responsible when you take the wrong decisions, etc., or is it more than that? So it's something more complicated or more complex than that.
I mean, that's a really interesting question. I mean, although I say they're not regulated, there are regulations around what municipalities can do that have a big influence on the way in which they should be or shouldn't be run. So on the one hand, yeah, the personal liability comes from if you're a director of any kind of private profit-making firm, and so that's the broader environment of business regulation rather than public sector regulation. And I think it's something that politicians are being advised to consider before they take up a directorship, and I think that probably is a disincentive, and it's probably a good thing. The other thing, though, that is within this sort of public regulatory framework, the directors of the municipal corporations are still answerable to the municipality in general, and so in various ways that too means or should mean that the decisions about the things they do are at least in the public interest in the first place. In the second place, though, we've spoken to some of the auditors of local authorities' accounts, and they pay a lot of time and attention to making sure that the way in which these corporations are run isn't sort of politically biased. So, for instance, they could do certain sorts of, say there's a local election coming up, they might do a particular drive with a municipal corporation to cut costs. So I think they might cut the price of, I don't know, let's say going to the swimming pool by 100% or something. Free swimming for, I don't know, whatever it would be, the month before the election. But so there's also the audit committee within the local municipality, which is overseeing some of this behaviour and trying to ensure that everything that's done is in the public interest. And there are cases, because it's become so much more prevalent in the last 4 or 5 years, there's been cases of auditors raising what they call public interest reports about the management of corporations. And especially though, this is probably a bigger problem in the UK than the issue of politicians getting up to no good in the corporations, is the actual local authorities, the municipalities themselves, badly running municipal corporations. So there's a famous case of a property development company in Slough, which has been, the local government has basically been lending them money. They lent them, I think it was £200 million, and basically almost wrote off the debt because they couldn't manage to find a way to get the organisation to manage the money properly. So there's layers and layers of this stuff. I think it's, but as you say, on an individual level, I think that sort of personal liability will be something that politicians at least have to think about.
Okay, Mário, let me do my comments in one more question first, and after me, you put your questions, okay, Mário? Could it be? Rhys, I think in Brazil nowadays, a very good field research is related to the environmental areas or parks here, because there is some kind of decentralization of the control of the government over these areas, and some proposals to PPP strategies to manage these areas. And I think so, during the pandemic, a lot of communities, favelas in Brazil, created some kind of mechanism to protect the local people, giving food security and health support. And maybe this kind of service will change to a more connected relation with the state. I don't know. We have a very extensive network of civil society organizations related to favelas in Brazil, called CUFA, Central Única de Favelas. That is a very interesting work in this perspective. But my question is about the whole of civil society and the civil society activists or the representative bureaucracy on the board, or in some kind of mechanisms or strategies of dialogue with stakeholders. This kind of power has some influence in the Publicness or not? Do you have some data about this?
That's a really good point, because as you say, particularly this is a problem that people who are working on municipal corporations have identified, that there's a disconnect between the local people and accountability of these corporations. It's sort of indirect through the municipality in general. In terms of representation on the board of directors, what you'll find is that for community orientated services like housing, possibly social care, but definitely housing, there's often a requirement that there is a recipient of those services as a representative on the board of directors. So that is more, those types of services are in usually the non-profit form of municipal corporations. So they have a very different sort of way of going about things. And in that sense, they are more connected to stakeholders, where I think the profit-making types of corporation usually have a smaller board, and it's usually people who've got experience of being directors in other private sector organizations who are involved, either as a non-executive type of director or as a professional executive director. And as you say, that does raise a question about the extent to which that is responsive to societal stakeholders. Again, all of these questions are things that aren't, because it's so sort of unregulated in terms of what you expect in the UK. There's a lot of big questions about if this is the sort of future, how anybody's going to be able to sort of manage accountability in these complex systems.
Thanks a lot. Mário, please.
Okay, now I was just going to mention something that I completely forgot, and this is something that I've been doing research on, which is sometimes it's recently and especially during the pandemics, my cat just wanted to participate as well. And during the pandemics, we had seen the effects of different forms of cash transferring. So Tel mentioned one that has been brought by civil society organizations, trying not only to bring cash, but also to bring food and some services. But at the same time, we have some municipalities entering in cash transfer schemes as well. And in order to do this, some of these municipalities created municipal banks. And so this is a very interesting thing. So the most famous one was one that was created was created before the pandemic crisis, which is in Maricá near Rio de Janeiro there. And it's very interesting because from one day to the other, they established a municipal bank, and using public civil servants that comes from social services to become bank agents. And that's very interesting because, well, the bank has two objectives. One is to manage the cash transfer. But there is another thing that is very interesting, which is, well, they also provide microcredit. And that's an interesting situation there. Because when you, for example, when you approach these civil servants that are running the bank, they don't know how to do it because they were not trained to become credit agents or something like that. So this is something that has become spread in this region around Rio de Janeiro. It's become different municipalities are using this because they're using oil royalties in order to fund these kind of things. But we've been monitoring at least 38 municipalities here in Brazil doing this kind of things. I understand, and this is also something that is very interesting because in terms of jurisdictional, from a jurisdictional perspective, it is not the role of municipalities to run cash transfer schemes for people. So we have also here a very interesting confusion in terms of the role, the jurisdiction, and the institutional and the institutionalization on this. So I think, and this is something that I think it's a trend here. This is a trend here in Brazil, at least. Lots of other municipalities around Brazil are trying to do this with some are in a very early stage. Other ones are much more complex on this, but this is also something that is there. And that I would wonder, for example, also another thing that is been interesting, and I would like to hear about this, is a phenomenon of the startupization of the public sector, which means that, well, we have also in some municipalities here, the idea of bringing small companies, small startups, in order to provide some public services. Some of them became very big. For example, we have here in São Paulo, we had competitors against Uber, for example, that emerged here. But we have, for example, in the municipality of Araraquara, the mayor sponsored the creation of a cooperative in order to do this kind of things. So I think I would like to, if you could talk a little bit about if this phenomenon of startupization is also in your radar in terms of research or not, in terms, especially at the local level.
Yeah, well, thanks. I was interested to hear about the microcredit. And I think the municipalities here have been using corporations to go into areas that perhaps they're no longer responsible for. So there are energy companies, for instance, that have been set up on varying models, some as mutuals, sort of cooperatives, and some of them have done okay, and some of them have had to close down. But in terms of startups, I mean, I think the only thing I would say that is similar to that I'm aware of is there have been policies, and there certainly is one in Wales at the moment, that when they let contracts at the local level for various types of services to the municipality, they should prioritise local suppliers, which usually means local SMEs, basically. But I think they've moved away from that in England, and I haven't done any research on it specifically, but I have colleagues who work on that type of area, but they're more from the perspective of supply chain management rather than public administration. But I mean, I don't know if you mean by startups that's investing in small businesses to do that, or whether it normally, I would say the contracts that are let to SMEs here are to reasonably established businesses. But again, you wouldn't want to do this, but if you wanted to look at all the contracts that are let by local authorities in the UK, you can actually find it online now. So and you'll see that anything from £500 upwards, you can see that loads of small sums of money are given to local taxi firms and local caterers, and so there's lots of support potentially for local businesses in that sense. Yeah.
Well done, very well. So someone in the audience has more questions, comments? Professor Rhys, we have here my colleagues on the committee of our division. We take decision in a democratic way. We have Professor Tiago Dias here, Professor Sueli Ramos, and Professor Suilan Bidled here with us. Thanks to be here. In the audience, one more questions, comments? I don't think so. You don't have more questions. Professor Rhys, thanks a lot for your speech here, for your time. Congratulations for your research. We hope we can be in contact and do some research together in the future. Thanks a lot, Mário, for your comments, your ideas and discussion. Alqueta, too, thanks a lot for all the support from ANPAD. And Leonardo, very good look in the PhD research. And thanks a lot, Professor Rhys. I hope you visit us in the near future.
Well, thank you for inviting me, and yeah, hope to meet in person sometime. Yeah, thanks a lot.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Rhys. Thanks a lot.
Thanks a lot.
Take care.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye-bye. See you here. Thanks all the people from the support here too. Thanks a lot. See you. Bye-bye.